TSA lines, but this is just, what is this hazing at this point that Donald Trump is putting J.D. Vance through? Do either of y'all have a theory? Does anyone at the table have a theory?
I mean, that question was asked on live television on a major network about the sitting vice president of the United States. What is this hazing? And the thing is, that's not a rhetorical question. That's not a hyperbolic flourish from a pundit who got carried away. That is a legitimate, specific, documented question based on something that actually happened earlier that same day. Here's what went down. J.D. Vance was reportedly set to lead the U.S. delegation to Islamabad for the second round of Iran nuclear talks. That was the plan. Multiple officials knew it. Multiple outlets were reporting it. And then Trump, in a phone call with a reporter, said no, Vance wasn't going. It would be Steve Witkoff and Jared Kushner leading the negotiations instead. That's the president. Publicly. Overriding his own vice president's assignment. And then, less than 1 hour later, two senior U.S. officials told MSNBC that Vance would, in fact, be leading the delegation after all. 1 hour. Trump said one thing. The White House said the opposite. And nobody in that building issued a correction, an explanation, or an acknowledgement that anything unusual had just happened. Because for this administration, as the panel pointed out almost immediately, this is a Tuesday. But here's where it gets genuinely interesting. Because the question isn't just whether the Trump White House is chaotic. At this point, that's established. The more important question, the one the panel started working through, is whether any of this is actually accidental. Because there's a theory. And it's not a conspiracy theory. It's based on a very clear historical precedent from this same president with a different vice president. Let's hear it.
Yeah, I mean, my theory is that, J.D. Vance broke the agreement we have with his wife, and he's out skydiving with her as we speak. But what I really think this is, I think J.D. is really anxious about attaching himself too forcefully to this war. I think you could see it in the Jonathan Swan, Maggie Haberman story. Mm-hmm. When you're reading through it, it's like... it's like breaking down exactly what's going on. Then out of nowhere, J.D. Vance stands up and says, I oppose this war. You could tell he's desperately trying to signal opposition to the war.
Every major news outlet had sources coming to say the vice president really wasn't comfortable with this.
Exactly.
And for people at home who don't know how things work, just know that's not a coincidence.
I wonder if it was a coincidence that Tucker Carlson's son, Buckley Carlson, exited J.D. Vance's office just this week.
No, I mean, I don't think it's a coincidence because I think Vance knows. I mean, he's thinking about 2028. That's why Rubio would rather be anywhere. He'd rather be at a UFC fight than be doing these negotiations because he knows. I mean, look, we're back to square one here. We're back to genocidal threats. We're back to threatening,
power plants,
threatening to target the civilian infrastructure of the people we were claiming to supposed to be saving. And then meanwhile, now we're left with a more extreme Iran. We're left with now an Iran that has a more powerful deterrent. They realize they have a more powerful deterrent than a nuclear weapon. They could short circuit the entire global economy at will. So Vance sees how much this war has backfired. When you have 67% of the American people opposing it, a supermajority, basically the equivalent of a veto-proof majority, if the Congress actually reflected the will of the people. I think Vance knows if he wants to be a viable candidate in 2028, he has to show some kind of something here. But clearly, he can't decide what he wants to do.
It is so interesting, though, how it seems like Trump has allowed him to be in this sacrificial lamb position because Trump understands appearance and how the public reacts to things. He doesn't always receive the most accurate information, I think, from the people around him about polling. But I think he very much has a sense. You even heard him at one point before the first round of talks basically say, if it goes well, I'm going to take the credit. If it goes really badly, it's J.D. Vance's fault. And he's also protecting in the process Marco Rubio in a way. That's why Marco Rubio gets to hang out with him at the events, be around the celebrities and all that stuff. And I just think that's odd because if you zoom back 10 years ago, you would think Marco Rubio would be at risk in the same way that J.D. Vance would be at risk. But
I will point out that Donald Trump also put Mike Pence in charge of the COVID response in early 2020, and I think that was not a coincidence that he...
Mike Pence, COVID response, early 2020. If you were paying attention in this administration's first term, you remember exactly what happened. Trump handed Pence the COVID task force at the precise moment the pandemic was becoming impossible to manage and impossible to spin. And then, when it went sideways, when the response became a political liability, Pence was the face attached to it, not Trump. The panelist is saying Vance is in the same position right now, and the Iran war is his COVID. Think about the numbers for a second. 67% of Americans oppose this war. That's not a slim majority. That's not a polling margin of error. That is a supermajority, the kind of number that in a functional democracy would make any politician sprint to the exit. Marco Rubio apparently already figured that out. He's at events. He's with the celebrities. He's nowhere near the negotiations table. Vance is at the table. And here's the deeper problem for Vance specifically. He's trying to play both sides of this at the same time, and it's not working. His team is apparently leaking to the New York Times and every other major outlet that he's uncomfortable with the war, that he opposed it internally, that he's not really on board. But he's still showing up, still leading delegations, still accepting the assignment every time Trump hands it to him. That's not a strategy. That's a trap. Because if the Iran talks succeed, and right now, based on the panel's read of where things stand, we are back to square one, back to threats against civilian infrastructure, back to a more radicalized Iran that has discovered it can functionally hold the global economy hostage through the Strait of Hormuz. If it somehow works, Trump takes the credit. He said so himself. And if it falls apart, Vance led the delegation. There's also the Jared Kushner element of this that deserves a moment. The original announcement before the reversal was that Kushner and Witkoff would lead the talks. Kushner, who is not a diplomat, who holds no government position, who, as the panel noted, made comments about Gaza being potential waterfront property while a war was still active. He's being inserted into nuclear-adjacent diplomacy negotiations with no State Department backing on behalf of the Trump family. The fact that that was even briefly the announced plan tells you something about how these decisions get made. And then there's the broader dynamic the panel raised in the back half, the performance of strength versus the reality of constant submission. The MAGA political brand is built on dominance, alpha energy, toughness. But watch the actual relationship between these men and Trump. Hegseth, Vance, Rubio, before the pivot. They accept public contradiction, public humiliation, public reassignment without a word of pushback. Vance was told publicly he wasn't going to Pakistan. He went to Pakistan. That's not strength. That's the opposite. Here's the bottom line. What happened today with Vance and the Iran talks isn't a story about a scheduling mix-up. It's a story about power. Who has it? Who thinks they have it, and who's being set up to absorb the damage when things go wrong. The Pence parallel is the one that should give Vance the most pause. Pence took the COVID assignment in early 2020, and we all saw how that chapter ended, not just for the pandemic response, but for Pence personally. He was politically finished inside that world before the first term was even over. 67% of Americans oppose the Iran war. The strait is effectively closed. Iran has discovered a deterrent more flexible and harder to bomb than a nuclear program. The talks are back to threats. The administration's negotiating position, by the panel's read, is weaker than when this started. And J.D. Vance, the man who has been quietly signaling through every major outlet that he never really supported this, is the one who just got on the plane to Pakistan. Trump said Vance wasn't going. An hour later, he was. That's not confusion. That's a message. And if Vance hasn't figured out what it means yet, Mike Pence might be able to explain it to him. Subscribe and drop a comment. Do you think Vance is being set up, or is this just the chaos that defines every week in this administration? Share this if you think more people need to see the Pence parallel, because the media is not connecting those dots enough.